I also noticed that speaking in different languages brings different personalities, or people who speak about different things, they behave differently. And that was always very interesting to me, how language is a big part of how we think and how we behave. And that just gave me so much to work with when I would compose. And then on top of that, the sounds of the words also. As a musician, right, we pay attention to the sounds. So I think what I love about working with text is that it has both semantics to work with, the meaning of the words, but also the sounds. And if I am able to have control over the text, then it's really fun thinking how it interacts with the music later on.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. What is happening, y'all? Welcome to the show today. If you're new to the podcast, I'm glad to have you with us. My name is Tyler. I'm a composer, broadcaster, podcaster. I do a lot of different things, and really I'm just passionate about making stuff. And on this podcast, I sit down with other creatives to talk about their path to artistry, their craft, and basically what makes them tick. And if you've been here with us before, welcome back. Today on Music Maker, I'm joined by composer Ania Vu. Ania Vu writes music that explores the interplay between the sound properties of the words and their meanings, musical energy related to form, and varied notions of time. She also enjoys crafting her own text that serves as a sonic, formal, and expressive guiding reference in her musical writing process. It was great to finally sit down with Ania, someone I had only communicated with via email up until this point, to learn more about what makes her who she is. In this conversation, Ania shares what it was like growing up with a mom who is also a composer, how her multicultural background and interest in languages manifest in her music, the role of time as a philosophy in her practice, and so much more. Ania is a composer you're going to want to know about, and I can't wait for you to learn more about her. Just a bit of business to share, as we always do before we jump into the conversation. One of the simplest and indeed the best way for you to support this podcast is by listening to this episode, listening to earlier episodes, and then following the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released and pushed straight to your device. Shout out to the Patreon fam. As of recording this episode, we've got 20 amazing Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible, and you can join them. Support what we're doing on Patreon, and you'll get early access to episodes by becoming a subscriber for just $5 a month. That little bit of support does actually go a long way in helping me cover the cost of some of the tools I use to produce this podcast. Also, as of just a couple weeks ago, I have launched a new Patreon exclusive called The Workshop, and that's just this kind of audio journal space where I share a little bit about my own creative process as it pertains to some composition projects that I'm currently working on. So you can find a Patreon link and other ways to financially support the podcast on our website. That's looseleaftransmissions.com/support. Finally, an impactful and free way to help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating and, if you can, a review if you feel inclined. Or really what it boils down to is just word of mouth. Just tell a friend. If you've already left a rating and review, you can, spread the word about this podcast. And the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we are able to grow. So if you have just a few moments to do that, I would really, really appreciate it. Okay, on to my episode with Ania Vu. Well, Anya, thanks so much for sitting down with me today and talking for the podcast. And you're a composer whose music I've really admired for quite some time now. And it's been really exciting to see kind of your career growth over the past few years. And just really excited to learn more about you today.
Tyler, thank you so much for having me and for thinking of me. And I feel like we've been emailing back and forth for the past few years, and it's nice to finally talk in person with you. So thank you for this invitation.
Kind of where we always start here on Music Maker is as far back as you're willing to share or remember in terms of your creative journey. And so, what would you say is your earliest artistic memory as a composer, or even just as like your earliest memory making something?
So I have, I think, two answers for this question. When I think I started playing the piano when I was about 5.5. And I was very lucky that my mom is also a musician, and she's the one who brought me into music, found me a piano teacher, but she also would practice with me at home. She's also a composer. So when I was, I think, still like learning how to play the piano, I was playing around one day, and I composed this tiny little silly piece that's called Going to School. And my mom actually transcribed it down, and I had it learned and memorized, and I performed it for my teacher on my next lesson. And so that's like my very informal first piece. I think I still could play it today. I mean, it was a very simple piece, maybe like had 16, 32 measures. But my first actual composition I wrote when I was 15. And this was during the time when I was interested in thinking about doing film music one day. And I saw that there was this school composition contest in my music school. And I thought, maybe this is a good opportunity to write something for this and submit. So I wrote a piece without any, guidance. I just sort of wrote it on my own for fun for solo soprano and piano, called Somewhere Over the Clouds. And it's like a very tonal piece, lots of like extensions, like ninths, 11ths, thirds. I was listening to a lot of jazz. I didn't take any classes in jazz or anything. It was just from listening, and it was quite a simple piece, but it ended up being part of my portfolio when I was applying for college applications.
One of my typical questions for people is, when was your first encounter with a composer? And you're the first person who I've talked to whose parent, one of their parents or both were a composer. And that's really interesting to me. I mean, I'm sure that, I guess instead of asking you about your first encounter with a composer, I'll ask you, what was that experience like having a mom? I mean, I'm sure your musics are different in a lot of ways, and I'm sure were there challenges with that, or was it mostly a very supportive environment?
No, it was mostly very supportive. So she studied composition at the Knesset Academy of Music in Moscow, and then after she had me and started a family, both she and my dad, they sort of didn't end up doing what they studied, and both of them opened a business. So she didn't really compose when I was growing up. She only went back to it when I was around, like 15, 16. But I remember, like, the first time I heard her music, it was like a symphonic poem on this work of literature that felt very, very close to her. And I remember being so impressed when I listened to the recording for the first time. It would like seeing a completely different side of her and different talent, that I didn't know existed up until then. And it was a very, I just remember being hit quite strong after listening to that piece. But she was my first composition teacher, and we worked together on my portfolio when I was applying for school. And she was very, very detail oriented. I mean, the only pieces that I wrote were the ones that I submitted for the college application. So I didn't really have a lot of composing experience at all. It was all a very hectic time. I was just trying to complete the pieces on time so I could submit them by the deadline. The only piece that was written, sort of earlier was that was that saxophone and piano piece. But the other two pieces were written around, right a few months before the deadline. So a few years later, when I was around 18, 19. I think I learned so much from her. And regardless whether she's teaching me piano or composition, she's always been super meticulous. And I think it was a good thing because it taught me rigor and to be very intentional about the craft. But I think looking back, I think the downside of that was that I was a little bit afraid to compose because it just felt like this very laborious task, to compose, because she would be really nitpicky about everything. So yeah, even when I entered Eastman, I think I still had a bit of that in me where I didn't write a lot of music and I kept refining, revising all the time. And I think because of that, I didn't learn how to write a lot, or how to just not worry too much. And I think as composers, we do need to go through that period as well.
Yeah, I think for myself, realizing that there's there's a creative version of me as a composer, and then there's an editor version of me. And if I introduce the editor too soon, that's when the music stops. That's when it gets really challenging. And so
Absolutely.
It sounds like your mom was quite the editor as well.
Yeah, very much so.
Did she introduce you to a lot of contemporary music growing up?
To be honest, no. No. It's funny. I mean, when I was playing, the piano, we always had to play piece by Bach, classical sonata, romantic piece, a contemporary piece. The most contemporary I got was playing a piece by Bacewicz, who's a Polish composer. I think the piece was from the 1950s. But really, I mean, to us, Prokofiev was considered contemporary. I mean, this was, I guess 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I think maybe things have changed now, but yeah, it was very old school in a way. So I didn't know a lot of contemporary music until college, really, or right before college.
I'm kind of interested in hearing more about your background in Europe, because you are of Vietnamese descent, but you have roots in Poland, and of course you're now based in the United States. But what sort of creative foundation do you feel like this has given you? What kind of creative foundation did you gain in Poland, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky to be in Poland. They have wonderful public music schools. So I went to a music school from grade 1 until grade 12. And this was a school in addition to the normal day school. And so I would have ear training, theory from grade 1. And, then later take music history, music analysis, harmony, choir, music literature, all these classes I was taking before entering college. So I think it was quite a robust education. And I think also being a pianist, growing up playing classical piano, trying to, play at a professional level, really, I think influences how I compose to this day, even. I care about, the performers playing my music and how it feels for them to play the music. And I think that expressivity is important to me. I wasn't immersed at all in the new music scene or the composition scene in Europe. When I was living there, it was all classical music. I was going to Chopin competitions. I was going to piano master classes, piano festivals. It was very piano focused. So that definitely is a big part of, I think, my like musical upbringing. But my mom, I think her music is very much centered around, Vietnamese folk music. She really likes working with pentatonic scales. And when I first started composing, she would just teach me all the things that she knew. I think she enjoyed working with that scale, and then French poetry, and she also wrote song cycles in French to French poetry. And so, like, my first pieces were also written like that. And we were very close stylistically when I first started out. And then after that, over time, we have diverged as I have continued on here in the US.
I feel like you maybe answered a part of my next question just now, but I'll kind of ask you more directly. Do you feel like your multicultural identity has influenced how you make music, or kind of the aesthetics that you're interested in the directions you've gone?
Yeah, aesthetically, definitely. It's hard to pinpoint what it is, but of course, the culture influences how we are as people, and in turn, it influences how we make music. Like, you know how we stereotypically say, music from the Eastern European composers is like very lush and like very emotionally charged.
Yeah.
And composers from other parts of Europe, from the north, their music is sounds quite different. So of course, I think all of these things are a part of me. I don't feel like my music is fully like American or fully European. It's like a weird mix. Yeah, I don't try to like think too much about it. It's just what comes out and things that I find interesting or I enjoy listening to, and just being open to different styles and different composers, even when they are very different from each other. I think there's always something to learn from them. So that's just how I approach it.
Do you feel like that's evolved over time, or manifested in your music in different ways as you've gone further down this path?
Yeah, I mean, I think my music has evolved a lot in the past 10 years, definitely. In some ways, it has some part of the music has become a bit noisier, and then at the same time, it has become a bit maybe more like, I don't want to say tonal, but like have some functional harmony in it.
Yeah.
I don't think of it like that when I compose, but harmony is a big part of my process, and I really love crafting chords and chord progressions, not in a tonal, again, like tonal harmony, but that are harmonically driven in some ways. I mean, like Messiaen is one composer that I really admire, his harmonies. So yeah, I think it's definitely been evolving over the years, and also just like the music that I listen to, the music that I'm exposed to, music that I used to maybe not feel so close to. Now I kind of can feel, identify, not identify myself more with, but see the value in it more,
Mm.
or enjoy it more.
You mentioned that you wrote your first, I guess, quote unquote, serious piece when you were 15. Is that about when you decided you wanted to pursue composition as a career, or is that something that came? I mean, it seems like composing's always been a part of your life.
Well, only like, actually, I feel like I started quite late. Besides that piece that I wrote when I was 15, I had a gap until I was 19 and wrote other pieces. But as a teenager, I actually really loved film music. That was one thing that I mean, film music and jazz, I would listen to on my, during my free time. I really wanted to be a composer for Disney when
Mm.
I was a little girl. I was really obsessed actually with Alan Menken's music, because I was really drawn to the storytelling side of the music, and I think in a way I was reflecting on it recently, and I think that storytelling aspect hasn't left. A significant part of my music deals with language, deals with some form of storytelling. And even though I do not do film music now, I do think about it a lot. And I do think about like how music can be used as an expressive tool to convey a narrative, to convey like evolution of characters or
Yeah.
states. So I find that to be very, very fun to listen to and to compose.
I think film music is like, for people, I guess, in our generation, it's like one of the major gateways into composing.
Mm-hmm.
And along with, in more recent years, video game music. And I feel like I talk to so many composers and it's like, yeah, film music. And then I went to school and then it like shifted dramatically into not film music. I mean, is film music something you would still want to do? And I guess also, I mean, have you had an opportunity to do that, to collaborate with a filmmaker? Or I know you've done a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration work. Has film been a part of that?
So when I was at Tanglewood in 2022, one of the composing exercises was to write for film, and every year they do something different. In my year, there were five of us, five composers, and we were writing 10-minute chunks for a Charlie Chaplin movie. The Kid was the name of the movie, and I actually ended up having a lot of fun working on that.
Yeah.
And after that experience, it made me reconsider maybe like trying to maybe write for short film or independent film and whatnot. I think when I entered college, I was no longer interested in writing for film for a few years. I remember going to a workshop by Eastman alumna, actually. She was a composer and now doing film music. And she was telling us sort of how being a film composer is actually not as glamorous as it may seem. I mean, you do a lot of derivative work, and I wasn't so interested in that. Like the producers who didn't know as much about music as the composer, they would be the one dictating and telling you what they wanted. So I think that kind of killed my enthusiasm for film for a few years.
That makes sense.
But I think if I were to work with someone, more collaboratively and not just be told what to do, I think that would be a much more interesting collaboration.
I completely agree. So you've touched on this just a little bit, and this is something I'm really excited to explore about your work, and that is kind of this topic of language. So this is a major interest of yours within your work and also outside of it. Notably, you're fluent in 4 languages and you've studied 3 others. I'm sure, as anyone interested in languages, you probably also have like explored others beyond that. Can you talk about your interest in language, and in what ways does this interest manifest in your music?
Totally. So I went to a French school for 10 years, growing up from kindergarten until end of middle school. And so I was very lucky to learn French organically on top of, speaking Polish, because I lived in Poland, and speaking Vietnamese at home. And then English was mandatory, so we had to learn English. And languages were always my favorite subjects in school. I was always looking forward to Latin. A lot of people hated that subject, but it was my absolute favorite. And for some reason, they just came kind of easily to me. I didn't have to work as hard. And I would just easily remember the different cases, in Latin. Like it just felt like, fun puzzles to put together. But I never thought about combining language and music, like 2 of my big interests, until I think 2018, when I was composing and I was looking for text. Oh, one other thing I want to mention is also thanks to my mom, actually, like reciting poetry was something that I also really enjoyed. So in French school, we we would sometimes have to memorize poems and then recite them in class. And my mom also worked with me on that, and she, like, reciting poetry felt very much like performing a piece of music. There's, sense of time, you have to be clear, you have to project. And so I think both of these have like temporal dimensions, right? You have to know how you budget energy, like musical energy. That makes sense. So anyway, I also noticed that speaking in different languages brings different personalities, or people who speak about different things, they behave differently. And that was always very interesting to me, how language is a big part of how we think and how we behave. And that just gave me so much to work with when I would compose. And then on top of that, the sounds of the words also. As a musician, right, we pay attention to the sounds. So I think what I love about working with text is that it has both semantics to work with, the meaning of the words, but also the sounds. And if I am able to have control over the text, then it's really fun thinking how it interacts with the music later on.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that in just a moment, but this idea of, fluency in different languages allows you to kind of embody different personalities almost. I have a friend, actually, she's been on the podcast, Anna Hufka. She is half Japanese, so she's fluent in English and Japanese. And that's what she described to me one time. She said, when I switch into Japanese, it's almost like I'm a totally different person than when I'm, and of course there's like the cultural aspects of, politeness and that sort of thing in different languages. But do you feel like, I imagine you've written text in different languages for your pieces. Do you feel like that enables you to take on different musical characters as well and personalities?
I think so. Yeah. I think I was thinking this morning, literally, that it would be kind of cool. And again, I'm speaking out loud. It'd be kind of cool to have a song cycle of the same text, but in different translations, and see how I would set it differently. I think the result would be quite different, or maybe not as different as I would think. I don't know. It feels like a cool experiment to try and do that, because the same text could be perceived sarcastically, in one language, and then in another language it could be taken as literally. Again, depends on the culture. I think in Polish people tend to be way more sarcastic and kind of have this dry humor. They don't say positive things as much. So when they do, it might come off as mocking, right? But if I were to use that in English, it would maybe have a more genuine intention behind it. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. I'm not as linguistically inclined as you, but I've had my own interests in learning some language here and there. I actually have a piece that I wrote for our mutual friend Kevin von Kampen. I went to grad school with Kevin, and he commissioned me at that time to write a piece for vibraphone and voice. And it was just kind of a piece inspired by the Dada movement. So it was like really absurd in a lot of ways, very challenging, but something that he wanted as someone who would be playing vibraphone and singing and speaking while playing vibraphone is for it to be in different languages. And I think the idea of, obviously you need like the right collaborator for that, but the idea of even within one movement switching between different languages, it's a really interesting thing to me.
Yeah, totally. And when I speak to my mom and my dad, I also switch languages, because it's just whatever word comes first to my head, then I use it, and I don't think about what language I speak. But people who are around me, they always laugh and they say that, like, you sound insane.
I don't know. It seems like a superpower to me. I wish I could do that.
Well, then you run into the danger of not knowing any language very well.
That's true.
Yeah. Where you start to forget words.
So when you write for voice, you do often write your own text. How does the text that you write inform your music in general, whether that's sonically or formally, structurally, or expressively?
Hmm. So I usually start out with text. I think for me, starting out with text is really important. And then, not that music comes second, but mm, I feel like the text is the source of everything. And I mean, all of these, aspects that you mentioned, they influence the music in different ways. And, in some sections, one sounds of the words might be more important than the expressivity of the meaning of the words. Like all of these interact with each other throughout pieces. And so having that fluidity also is very exciting. When do I decide to, focus more on maybe the music, the expressivity of the text, and when do I just care about getting through the text? Almost like thinking of it as a recitative. There's a difference too, I've noticed, between writing a song and writing an opera, where you really care about getting the narrative out and understanding the words. And other times where, in songs, I think we have more freedom to do more abstract things with the sounds of the words.
Can you talk about your experience with opera a little bit? Because that's such a foreign thing to me that I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, I actually, my opera is still sort of 75% done. I still have two more scenes to write, but it was a very big project, and I had so much fun working on it. I started, and I really wanted to kind of do everything from scratch, so I didn't take any existing story. I wrote a story with a friend, a collaborator, Modesta, who is also a pianist. I mean, we met at a piano camp, but then we ended up doing different things. I ended up, composing. She's now in art school. She's a wonderful graphic designer and visual artist. And so we created a story that was based on our collective interests. Mine was, clocks, time,
Mm.
fantastical, surreal themes. And her drawings also are very fantastical. And so we would meet every week talking about, how to advance the story. And then once the story was written, I wrote the libretto in English. That was also big for me because I hadn't written, I think, text in English before. It was only in Polish. So I had it checked by native speakers, whether there were any awkwardness or mistakes in English. And then when I started writing the music, even then I would go back and keep refining the libretto. So again, this constant process of editing. Of course, I tried to have the libretto as done as possible. So I spent, I think, almost a year on the libretto before writing any music. I wanted to make sure that the story, there was an arc to the story, the development of the characters would make sense. I learned so much from that experience, and being a fellow at the Composers and the Voice program was also very, very informative. We worked with Mark Campbell, who was a librettist, and it was very interesting to hear him say how a libretto is different from poetry. It's different from prose. It's different from a play. Words in a play. So I think at the end of the day, it has to be compact enough and intelligible.
Yeah.
So I think like cutting things down always, like even, this word I don't need, even though it's a tiny little word, but it doesn't flow well. Really like working meticulously like that, crafting every single line, every single sentence. How can I express the same thing, but in fewer words? But it has to also sound and flow nicely because it's sung.
I feel like every composer I talk to who works in the opera world they all have the same thing in common, and that's this interest in storytelling, which makes, that's like, seems obvious, but, you talked about being interested in storytelling from a young age, and like a thread. It just seems like a common thread. I mean, do you feel like this is like a full expression of that aspect of you, being able to write an opera and tell your own story in some way?
Yeah, I think so. I think opera will probably be a big part of my work in general. Even as a pianist, I remember always being drawn to playing large scale pieces, Chopin ballades, or Dumka by Tchaikovsky, or even the variations, Beethoven's variations, the third movement of his Sonata 109, Opus 109. It's just 6 variations, theme and variations, but the way he wrote it, it's so different from his earlier variations that felt very much like exercises. But this piece felt like truly, his very mature voice, in telling a story of some, I don't know, to me, a character. The theme comes back at the end, but with an extra octave lower, so making it
Right.
seem like, the protagonist comes back and is wiser after all, everything they've been through. So for me, like, that evolution has always been so appealing to convey to the audience, and I think that translates to now me being a composer and telling a story, like having even more control, I guess, over how I can tell a story.
I gotta say, I'm quite struck by how you are able to also establish such unique sound worlds in your pieces right away. I mean, I was listening through a bunch of your music the past week or so, and it's just like you immediately transport me as a listener into some other place. That's the feeling I get, and
That's
I
very
feel like you,
kind.
well,
Thank
yeah,
you.
and you do it with such sensitivity and also this kind of sense of discovery. When did you initially become interested in, I guess, sounds, like sounds as a concept? I guess I'm thinking non-traditional or unusual or extended sounds techniques in your music.
I think it was maybe when I started my PhD at Penn. I was listening to more like Charino, Beat Fura. I really enjoyed their music. And then more recently, Igor Santos.
Yeah.
He's a younger composer, but I really admire his music. Joshua Hay, Catherine Balch. I I found that their music, was timbrally very, very nuanced, and I was really, really drawn to that. I think I always, because my music was so pitch oriented. I
Yeah.
always, because of my background and the music that I grew up listening to their music was so refreshing, and yet they also had this, their music was very sensitive and very expressive at the same time, even though they contained all these extended techniques. But I think those extended techniques spoke to me because they were used in a context. They were not just used as like a catalog of, here's a catalog of all these extended techniques, but they had purpose, and they were very intentionally used. And so I think that's what I try to do as well, to expand my sound world, not just be constrained to pitch and harmony, which are things that maybe come more easily to me, but think about more sounds, more color and timbre.
I totally relate because my I would kind of say the same thing about myself up until, I would say, for me it was the introduction of electroacoustic music into my life, and the music of Helmut Lachenmann, among the
Yeah.
composers you've already mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
really got me thinking about music in a totally different way. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
previously I thought about melody and harmony, that's music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It transformed my thinking into texture and gesture and like all these kind of, and how can I still incorporate, the harmonies I love, but
Yeah.
make it a little more texturally vibrant, I would say.
Yeah, one piece that I think really spoke to me and was something that felt to me quite new was a string quartet by Joshua Hay. He was a student at Penn, PhD student at Penn, and I just was a big admirer of his music. Anything that he wrote, I would listen to it many times and study the scores if I had access to them. And I think although my music doesn't sound anything like his, I mean, I would love for it to sound like his because I love his music. But it was really like it's so incredibly nuanced and subtle. But it just, I think I told him one day, like, I mean, your music is beautiful without trying to be beautiful.
Yeah.
Like, it just sort of exists. And like the way like time flows in his music also is something that feels very special. Almost feels as if like time stops. And one other thread in my work that I also think is almost as significant as my work with language is time perception in music. And this idea, that time always moves forward, and it, like philosophically speaking too, I think when I was going through some difficult things many years ago, I think I just didn't want time to move forward, and so how can I express that in my music? And that's the first time I think my music became more personal. Like it became something more than just me composing a piece for school, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite sound on an instrument, like a favorite technique or something you love to put into your music?
That's a very specific question.
I know.
I just love, I don't have a specific sound that I can mention, but strings.
Yeah.
Strings can do so much. And vocal too. But with strings, I mean, I love, maybe this is overused. I feel like all the composers overuse it, but I love the Ricochet Colenio Batuto.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't know, but strings. I think I really want to learn a string instrument so I can compose better for strings.
Yeah, I for sure think that string instruments have the widest vocabulary, I guess, of those types of sounds. And I also love writing for strings for that reason.
Absolutely.
So we've touched on a lot of aspects of your work that I feel like we could dive deeper into with my next question. And that is, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
Yeah, so I mean, I just mentioned, different notions of time in music, writing, composing text. I do think of my practice of writing text being almost integral as part of the composing music process. And then the third one I would say is like sounds and gestures of the natural world, like how a ball bounces on the floor and like just literally like forces of physics.
Yeah.
Just imitation of natural world. Bird sounds, I find those to be somehow very like just nice to be writing something that is part of the world that we live in.
Yeah, I love that. I'm really interested in hearing more about the way that you work with time, literally, because music is time for the most part. It's an art form constrained by time and duration. I almost feel like as composers, we are painting time. I mean, that's our medium. And you had mentioned that, you wanted time to stop. I mean, to me, that idea in music has a lot of implications and you can do a lot with time in music. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this interest of yours and how how you work with time specifically.
So as I mentioned, I think my interest in time was prompted by, going through this difficult period that made me just want to, like, I myself, not as a composer, but as a human, I didn't want time to move forward.
Yeah.
And I was thinking a lot about how, things constantly change over time, and how we don't really have any, like, philosophically, we don't have any control over that. And how scary it is that time always moves forward, whether we like it or not. I think that's how my very first piece relating to time came about, Against Time, for solo piano. And I think in a way, the first 2/3 of the piece is about me trying to, like, pull time from going forward. And it's very slow, very quiet, very meditative. There are bell sounds. And then the end of the piece is suddenly like we have to let go of that, time that we have been pulling backwards, and then it just kind of goes, right?
Yeah.
So I think of it also physically that way, because it's impossible to stop time. So even if we try to manipulate it, it will catch up with us eventually. So that was one piece, and then TikTok is another piece that I wrote in 2019. And in a way, I wasn't initially planning on the piece to be relating to time, but it was written for the tak ensemble. And so the sound tak has quite a lot of meanings in Polish. So I wrote a poem in Polish using the word tak. And then, of course, tik-tak, which means tick-tock, also relates to time. So I thought, maybe I can sort of weave that aspect of time and language, like wordplay, in this piece. And so the piece is really about, like, ticking clocks, and that's the A section. Then the B section is where time suddenly becomes suspended. Again, I, for some reason, I'm really drawn to this feeling of time, like, ceasing to exist, and we just sort of float in it. And tomorrow, actually, I have a premiere of another movement that will go with TikTok, and it's a different take on time. The movement is called coś. It's also in Polish, which means something, and it's this poem about the genesis and disintegration of something. It's very vague. Like, I'm not specifying what it is. It could be anything. It could be a feeling, an object, a living cell, a person. So it's really about time, but through the lens of something that comes into existence and then disappears. And then we wonder, what was it really? Like, we think we know what it is because we have assigned a word to it. So anyway, yeah, that's another piece, newest piece that also pertains to time. Maybe it doesn't have as many word plays as TikTok or some of my other vocal pieces, but yeah, I think it's still relevant to the theme of time, and I want to add maybe one or two more movements into this cycle that revolves around time and memory and loss. Ultimately, I think time for me is ultimately about loss because we hold on to something for a bit, and then it goes away.
Yeah, that's it's heavy.
It is. It really is. I mean, and that's where it comes. That's where it came from. I mean, for me, that's how I became interested in this philosophically, like, in this notion of loss, like dealing with loss.
Hearing you describe the suspension of time in music brings to mind, like, musical mobiles, kind of that idea. I mean, I would imagine that this philosophy in your work could invite some really interesting metric possibilities. I mean, in those moments, do you think about music in a modular fashion, or do you literally suspend time and that there is no meter, kind of talking about the nuts and bolts of things now, but
Yeah, totally.
it's fascinating to me.
So for this newest piece that I just mentioned, Sosh, during the section where the text talks about like when this something is emerging, right? Like before we know what it is, I did initially have like boxes and give the players the freedom to do a bit of improvisation. However, I ended up actually discarding that, and I stuck with time signatures. I initially didn't want the music to reflect the meaning of the text, but musically, yeah, I ended up being more conservative, which was a little bit of a letdown in a way. But I think there's this part of me that wants to convey an idea in many different ways, but then there's also part of me that likes to have control, and so I think that in the end sort of won. But I might revisit that idea maybe in a different movement.
And of course, there's the practical question of can this be conveyed in standard notation, and if so, why not? Why not just do that anyway? So what is a piece of music or a song, a book, a piece of art, any kind of artistic artifact that has had like a profound impact on your work, maybe changed the way you thought about your creative practice, maybe even changed your life?
Well, I think that String Quartet by Joshua Hay actually was a piece that I always go back to, and the one that made me kind of think about music differently. It's called Lens from Alpha Centauri. It's been a piece that I've liked, for many, many years. I think especially like the first few years I was really struck by it. I think maybe more recently, I mean, this piece I also have known for a while, but Let Me Tell You, I think it's also about time, very much so. And the text is absolutely beautiful. I mean, I go through different phases too. I mean, I go through phases when I don't listen to a lot of contemporary music, and I listen to a lot of jazz. Like the past few months, I've been listening to more jazz. I don't know if it changes how I compose. I don't think so, but but it's definitely challenged me in having. So I started taking jazz piano lessons actually the past half a year or so, and something I've always wanted to do, and it's been really ear opening. To study it, because I feel like, I mean, jazz is such a difficult genre, and I have so much respect for jazz musicians for being able to improvise within some given constraints, right, and still be so creative with it. I think that's something that classical musicians don't have to deal with at all. Like, it's a very, very different way of making music.
I feel like jazz should be more a part of our education, actually, for that reason. Because it seems like it's always so compartmentalized. Like, here's classical music, here's jazz, and then contemporary classical music falls under classical music. But obviously, there can be like a ton of overlap.
But it's just such a different way of thinking about music too, which I think is almost the opposite of, as classical musicians, we are refining every single note, but in jazz, it's a bit different, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a jazz pianist, but I think they spent time practicing improvisation, practicing playing in different modes, being very creative within the constraints that are given by the tune.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in if and how jazz piano lessons will impact your work in the future.
Yeah, me too. I'm curious.
Because I did take one semester of jazz piano lessons in college. I'm not a pianist, by any stretch of the imagination, but I could play chords and a melody.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was very, like you said, it was ear opening, just being able to put words to all these chords and harmonies that I innately loved, and suddenly being able to say, oh, well, I can apply this to my work in this way, even if it's just, okay, I know what this is now. I know what this is I like. So,
Yeah. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I definitely want to keep taking jazz piano lessons for at least another year. I found this great jazz piano teacher, Steve Million, very cool last name. And yeah, he's a very good pedagogue and practicing and still, actively performing jazz pianist.
So I was watching the video of your piece, Kutsa, which please correct if I'm mispronouncing that. Yeah. Which is a music that's been choreographed, and it's just a really wonderful work. But something that really stood out to me is the way that you convey this idea of communication in the piece. And so can you talk a little bit about maybe this piece in particular, but also what role do communication and even emotion, for that matter, what role do they play in your music?
So the piece was inspired by, I suppose, two entities that are trying to communicate, and they have, the best of intentions, but they just cannot understand each other, and they cannot, they just don't get each other. So initially, when I was telling my collaborator, my choreographer, Noelle Kaiser, about this concept of the piece, she said, "Oh, maybe we could have, aliens crashing on Earth and trying to communicate with the humans." And so, at first, I didn't want like this, because I think the idea of this failure to being able to communicate was like a serious sort of topic, and I didn't want to spin it into something very silly. But in the end, I thought that actually added a nice layer to it, and I wanted the ending to be a little poignant. I forget what happens, but the ending, I think musically, I was trying for it to sound more poignant. And so basically what happens in the piece is the first half or 2/3 of the piece, the aliens are trying to communicate with humans, and they make all these weird sounds, and then over time these sounds become words because they've been trying to learn English. And then finally, at the end, when they express each other freely in their own alien language, I tried to write music that feels very communicative, if that makes sense. So even though they're speaking gibberish, but they're doing so in a convincing, expressive way, I wanted the emotions to like transcend the meaning of what they say. And the text for that, the gibberish, came from the same text, but just like backwards.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Does this kind of idea of communication, does that pop up in other pieces of yours? I mean, it seems to go hand in hand with language and text and some of the stuff we've been talking about a lot, but I feel like, there's text setting, which we all know what that is, of, setting text to music. But, when you add the idea of communication to that, it seems to me to change it spins it a little more into something real, I think.
Totally. And I think I also reflect a lot on language and its limitations. How much can we convey through the words? And what is it that, we will never be able to communicate? And yet, if we don't have language, we might still be able to communicate by, our body language, our, eagerness, or whatever. Language can come from different sources. It doesn't have to be just spoken literally. So I think music can really sort of help with that too. That's when music comes in, and it can help express what is, fill in with the barrier of like different language.
So in other words, music can be like the binding thread to it.
Yes. Thank you.
I love that. It gives me a lot to think about, actually. So You have a project with pianist Unmiko, who is a close friend and collaborator of both of ours. And this project is called The Music She Writes. Can you tell us a little more about this initiative and what makes this sort of advocacy work important to you as an artist?
Yeah, so we began this during the pandemic, and Unmi and we had never met until years after we had put this online festival together. The way it started was Eastman had its centennial, and we both wanted to do something for it, and they were so the way Eastman celebrated its centennial was by celebrating with 100 concerts.
Oh yeah.
And so that's how me and I thought, oh, maybe let's do something together, and let's our concert will be on the Eastman website, and we will be able to connect with a lot of friends and have put something that is meaningful to us. And at the time, we thought about Asian female composers, that there's many of them, and yet they write such different music. I mean, there's so many interesting things that they do, and it'd be nice to kind of put light to their work. But we didn't want to constrain them to just like their identity. We wanted to give them full freedom to present whatever pieces that they wanted. So for some of them, we did ask them, oh, we listened to your works and we really like this piece and we would like to include it in our festival. And they were always very receptive to our suggestions. And I think we featured about 25 composers. And after the pieces were picked, then we thought about like common themes and grouping these pieces into specific themes for specific concerts. So that curatory part was also really fun. Thinking of a title, thinking of an overarching theme. We haven't been able to do anything in person. I think that was initially the plan. After the festival was successful, we wanted to do something in person, but we live in different places.
Sure.
I'm still sort of in transition, professionally speaking. Like I'm teaching part-time here and there. So, but maybe once I have something more stable, it would be nice to do something in person.
Do you do other kind of advocacy work besides this one project? I mean, what does that mean to you?
For me, it's really just, I really like showcasing other people's work and being like, oh, look, what are the cool things that people are doing? And, Asia is a huge continent, and I really like the variety of the work that we were able to get. I mean, when people think of Asian, they don't think that there's, also like the western part of Asia, right? Like Iran. Right. I mean, there are so many interesting composers from Iran, and then through to India, to Japan, to China. I mean, there's just so much there. And there's so many other composers that we didn't get to feature because we keep. But it'd be cool to feature more, and also maybe composers who are not based in the US, but Asian female composers who are based in Europe. I also met some people after who reached out to me through the website. This composer from Norway, and she told me, "Wow, this is so inspiring. I didn't meet many female Asian composers until I was much older, and this is really cool and very moving to see this happen."
That's great. So, kind of kicking off my final set of questions, and these are questions that I ask everybody. So, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't your art? If you were not a musician, what kind of work can you imagine doing?
Something that has maybe at the intersection of language and psychology, some kind of research. I think I I mean, teaching is also feels like a big part of my identity and research
Yeah.
in a way. I mean, composing is not like rigorous research, but in a way, it is research and discovery. So I think again, my love for languages, and then paired with psychology. I actually started out as a psychology major with composition at the University of Rochester and at Eastman, and then I dropped it down to psychology minor. So yeah, that would have been one thing, and then another thing would have been maybe doing something that has to do with preserving the environment.
Yeah.
Or architecture. Yeah, being a sustainable architect. I don't know if I would be good at it, but it sounds like a very cool cool
Yeah.
thing.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, that's an interesting note because so many composers are writing music that responds to environmental issues and climate change. And I mean, do you have any music that tackles that? I mean, do you have any sort of activism through your art on that note?
I've thought about it a lot. And actually for quite a few years I've been thinking about that, and I started a piece for when I was writing for sub percussion. I think the initial draft was them playing on just like trash instruments that I
Yeah,
brought.
that's great.
Yeah, it didn't end up being just them playing on trash instruments, but some of the things did survive. They did make it into the final piece. But yeah, it's something that I want to think more deeply about, and I don't want to just write a piece about, like, I wanted to make a deeper impact. I just don't
Yeah.
know what it would look like yet. Yeah, I definitely want to convey that in my music somehow.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying, it's not just a piece and then you kind of slap meaning onto it
Yeah,
arbitrarily. I
yeah.
think it's important that if we are going to make a difference as artists, it has to be a lot deeper, like the way you're
Hmm.
describing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have some thinking to do about it.
Yeah. Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And when I say tool, it could be like an actual object, a software, it could be a process that you enjoy that is helpful to you. Anything like that.
I do not. But I cannot offer any tools, but maybe just one. I think one thought that I would like to offer, at least something that has helped me a lot when I compose, is just to remember to compose music that we think only we can write, and not try to sound like anyone else or follow any trends. Yeah. So
That's important.
yeah. I mean, it sounds like cliche, but it's really important, I think, to remember. Like, just write music that only you can write.
I would also add that when you do that as a composer, that's the music that resonates the most as well, when it's like the most genuine, no matter what it
Uh,
sounds like,
I
aesthetically
agree.
or stylistically.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what I find, at least.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah.
So my final question, it's kind of your chance to really share whatever you'd like. And that is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I think things are changing generally. Like how people view contemporary music. I think people are becoming more and more open. But I think, yeah, I think throughout the years I've also maybe cared less about what people think and whether I belong to this camp or that camp. I think, but whether we like it or not, our music will be sort of put in a box in some ways. I mean, as humans, right? We always like, just to make things simpler in our brains. We like to put things in boxes, and that can sometimes come with judgment too. And I wish that there was no judgment.
Yeah.
Hmm. And that it was not about the style, but more on the craft. People focusing more on the craft and the quality than style. And I had a friend who told me, he wrote this beautiful piece, and he told me, oh, but it's just film music. Or actually, I didn't. He said, yeah, it's for film. And he sounded a bit embarrassed. And I totally understand where he's coming from, because I would have probably felt the same way. But then I told him, I mean, if it's done well, it doesn't matter if it's for film or if it's for the Arditi Quartet.
Right.
Again, and I'm guilty of this too, because, there's so much good music and interesting music being written all the time around us. And, I certainly, all the times I feel, oh, I wish I could write like this, or this is super cool. But, we cannot really change who we are. And at the end of the day, the music that comes out of us is really who we are. And I think we just need to embrace that more.
Completely. Yeah. Ania, this was a fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed every moment of it, getting to know you a little better and learning more about your philosophies and your craft. And just want to say again, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a lot of fun, and also made me think about things that I haven't thought of before. So thank you.
There's just so much good stuff to get from that conversation. And I know it's basically in the name of this episode title, but Ania's whole approach to language and music and how that informs almost sort of like a musical personality in her work, that's going to be something that I think about for a while. Ania Vu is on the web at ania.vu, that's ANIA.VU. And that's where you can find videos of a lot of her work, see what she's up to, basically your one-stop shop for all things Ania Vu. I'm Tyler Kline, and thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com, where you can find more episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support this podcast and our network. That's all I've got for today. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you here for the next episode.